Welcome to the Healing Pain Podcast with Dr. Joe Tatta. Each week, we interview top experts in physical therapy, pain science, and integrative pain care. You'll learn the most up-to-date information for treating and reversing persistent pain. This podcast is for educational purposes only and not intended to be used as personalized medical advice. And now, here's your host, Dr. Joe Tatta.
Hey there, friends. Welcome to this week's episode of the Healing Pain Podcast. This week, we're discussing how to reframe pregnancy-related pelvic girdle pain beliefs. My guest this week is Dr. Sinéad Dufour. She is an associate clinical professor in the Faculty of Health Science at McMaster University in Canada and conducts research in both the schools of medicine and rehabilitation science. Her current research interests include conservative approaches to manage pelvic floor dysfunction, pregnancy-related pelvic girdle pain, and interprofessional collaboration models to enhance pelvic health. Sinéad engages in clinical practice through her work as the Director of Pelvic Health Services at the World of My Baby, a perinatal care center in Ontario, Canada. Dr. Dufour is an advocate for women's pelvic health and a regular invited speaker at conferences around the world. On today's episode, we discuss risk factors for pregnancy-related pelvic girdle pain and why there's a need to reframe the treatment of pregnancy-related and non-pregnancy-related pelvic girdle pain. Despite mounting evidence of the role that psychosocial and physiological factors play in pelvic girdle pain, it continues to be mostly misunderstood and mistreated and really approached as a purely biomechanical issue, which is why this week's episode is so important. People who experience persistent pain and other symptoms during pregnancy can be at risk for long-term physical as well as mental health outcomes. Okay, without further ado, let's begin and let's meet Dr. Sinéad Dufour and gain a deeper understanding of pregnancy-related pelvic girdle pain. Hey there, Sinéad. Welcome to this week's episode. It's great to have you here.
Hi, Joe. It's great to be here.
I'm excited to speak with you about this topic. It's one we have not covered on the evolution of the Healing Pain podcast. And as we know, women and pelvic girdle pain is an issue. And it's something that, of course, many women's health specialists see, but particularly women's health physical therapists and pelvic health physical therapists. So I'm excited to speak with you. I know a lot of what we're going to talk about today, you do have published and wrapped around in some evidence. Mm-hmm. Everyone's going to listen to what you say today, take notes intently, because I always tell people, hey, take some notes as you're listening. But I also want to point them to that evidence-based article. So just tell us where that article can be found before we start to chat.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is an article in the British Journal of Sports Medicine. It has a nice kind of succinct summary, but also an infographic that really just kind of punctuates some of the key points and really where we have to kind of change our thinking on this issue. So hopefully it's easy for practitioners to kind of understand and digest, and then also those people who have pain.
And just tell us what the title of that article is, because people can obviously go into Google and put British Journal of Medicine, and the title is what?
Yeah, so it's called Reframing Beliefs Regarding Pregnancy-Related Pelvic Girdle Pain. And really, it is essentially, mapping out why and sort of the state of the science to convince us that we really do need to reframe our current beliefs on this issue if we are really wanting to help people.
Right. So reframing, which means how our thoughts and what we believe about a certain topic impact our behavior, our choices, and our health. Why is it time for us to reframe pelvic-related or pelvic girdle pain at this time?
Yeah, so this is a great place for us to start, I think, Joe. So really, your whole podcast is all about, I think, trying to translate this evolution in science when it comes to understanding pain. And while I feel like from the perspective of a physiotherapist, and I teach at McMaster University, so I'm a clinician and I'm also a professor, I've had a chance even to witness, even with physiotherapy students, how they're understanding how to conceptualize a pain experience in an individual differently and really kind of approach it more from a multifaceted perspective, right? In accordance with our evolved science. But it's so interesting that with this presentation, this issue of pregnancy-related pelvic girdle pain, there's a real resistance to wanting to apply everything we know about pain to this particular pain experience. It's really, really interesting. So, I feel like all of us are kind of moving a little bit slower than some of us might like, but in the direction of this evolution, that this is a pain experience that should also be moving along and seems to be really sort of cemented. And so, it's time that perhaps even as researchers and clinicians, maybe we're coming up with better ways to mobilize the information, which is the whole point around the infographic. So people understand the state of the science is applied to this scenario too, because we really have to move away from thinking about this issue to do with stability and relaxin, and it's just a part of the pregnancy and it's inevitable and it's going to get worse as the pregnancy moves on because that's what the driving factors are. These things are not true. They're not substantiated, and they actually can cause a lot of fear and make the whole situation worse. So it really is time for us to use all our insight and kind of use it to reframe this scenario, just like we have other pain conditions.
So you mentioned resistance. So when you say resistance to the concept, really, where do you feel, where have you noticed that you're being met with pushback or stress around this topic? Is it coming from one particular person, a particular group? Where do you notice this the most?
To be honest, I actually notice it across many different areas, which, really points to me that the story that has been told, right, that when we're pregnant, we have this hormone relaxin. Relaxin, of course, makes the structures relax and more malleable. And it's such a plausible theory, right? That this relaxin hormone is going to make things unstable. And surely that is then why people are having pain. It's a story that has just been so sticky. And so it's interesting. I mean, I see it in my students who actually sort of are presented. We do all problem-based learning at McMaster University. So we do problems related to this issue at the very end of the student's 2-year curriculum. So they've learned all about, nociplastic pain and persistent pain and the biopsychosocial approach. They've learned all of that and have been kind of immersed and scaffolded in that in different ways. And then at the end, we come to this issue. And without fail, every single year, students forget all that and want to go back to biomechanics. Similarly with clients that, I interface with and where I practice at the womb, the world of my baby, I really focus in perinatal care. So this is a huge population I see is people who have this pain experience when they're pregnant or in the first year postpartum. And a huge proportion of them either themselves have these notions of why they're having this pain, just from their understanding from culture, or have been told this by very well-meaning practitioners, right? So I do think it really is across the board that there is this false understanding of what's at the root of this particular pain experience.
Okay, so let's take a little example, because before you and I hopped on, I did some Googling and searching, because it's always fascinating, as you know, to go online and start to look up different topics about pain, because you get all sorts of things from the brain to certain herbs and nutrients. So let me read something that I found on pelvic girdle pain, and then you can break this down for us and explain pelvic girdle pain how you would like us to understand it. So this is what it said online. Pelvic girdle pain is typically caused by the joints moving unevenly, which can lead to the pelvic girdle becoming less stable and mobile and very painful. As your baby grows in the womb, the extra weight of your child and the way you change your sitting habits and posture will put more strain on your pelvis.
Right.
So now you and I read that. We have a background in physical therapy, in health, and pain science. But I was trying to read it through the eyes of a woman who's pregnant, who's suffering either pre or postpartum with probably chronic pain, right? And they read that, and what's the first thing that they think?
So the first thing I think people think, honestly, is that sounds plausible. In ways, it sounds like that could make sense. It's a plausible theory, right? But then the next thing I think people will think is, well, if this is related to my pregnancy and I'm going to get more pregnant, this is a scenario that's going to get worse, right? And then how on earth am I to birth my baby through this structure that is already really, really uncomfortable to the point that this issue is quite debilitating for people functionally, and them trying to fast forward to what state they're going to be in, and how on earth are they going to birth a baby with a pelvis in that state? And then how on earth are they going to take care of a child after that? That to me is exactly what I would expect. And it's actually what I see in practice. I see that play out every day. And, the real issue with that is that it's wrong. What you actually described is almost exactly, what has been described in the literature previously, because it very much is what we thought was going on. It's just that those theories have actually been disproven. We have a systematic review that confirms that relaxin does not at all correlate with pain state. Does it correlate with increased movement? Yes, but we have no correlations that increased movement correlate with more pain, right? And we also see that this is a scenario that pops up much more frequently in a second or third pregnancy rather than a first. So if it had something to do with relaxin, well, wouldn't everyone have it? Because everyone has relaxin. Wouldn't, mamas who are carrying multiples, who, for twins alone, it's like a 3-fold times of relaxin. Wouldn't we see it more with that? We don't, right? Wouldn't we see a mama, having the same sort of issue in her first pregnancy? We don't see that. And so, when you start to poke holes in the theory just from that perspective, it doesn't hold up. But quite honestly, it has been tested and looked at and synthesized that this doesn't relate to instability or relaxin. And actually what's transpired over the course of the last decade, as we've learned a lot more about pain science, is sort of what are the real actual things kind of going on. And those have been much more well substantiated now. They just have not been translated particularly well.
So, people they're going to listen to this. They're going to say, well, are you saying that hormones don't play a role in pregnancy or in the experience of pain when a woman is pregnant?
So no, we're not saying that at all, but we're saying, but it's not how we thought, right? We thought the way hormones were playing a role was that hormones was essentially making a scenario where there was too much movement and instability, and then that was an issue. We know that is not the case. Do we know, for example, that estrogen as a hormone is a bit of a sensitizer when it comes to the pain system? We know that. We know that estrogen increases 1,000-fold in pregnancy. So is it quite possible for people who are maybe already at a bit of an edge in their physiology that their systems with that additional estrogen, that's a sensitizer for them? Yes, perhaps. Do we know that cortisol, this is another hormone, we have lots of data to understand what cortisol does in terms of kind of ramping up the system. And so no, hormones, of course, are always going to be relevant when it comes to a pain experience, but it's just not how we thought. And it really isn't around the stability piece.
So if a woman comes to you and she's on her second pregnancy, and the first one went really smooth, she loved it, she was happy, she had no physical symptoms, no complaints. But the second pregnancy, there's pelvic girdle pain, and she comes to you and she's like, why is this happening? My first one was a breeze and nothing's changed. My health is the same. I eat the same. I move the same. Why is this different?
Okay. So, you answered some of that there, Joe, but always my first question back is, well, what do you think? Like, what do you think is actually going on? What do you think might be causing the pain? So in that scenario, you indicated, look, everything's the same. I'm kind of stumped. But I still probably would ask that. And what I often get back is, Well, I'm sitting a lot more. My posture hasn't been as good because I've been carrying around my previous child. I think my core isn't as strong as it used to be. These are the answers I tend to get back, right? And how I will usually sort of meet that is say, okay, so that's plausible because at the end of the day, anything with the human body is plausible and possible. And, we still only know a fraction of the complexity, right? But I will kind of say, all right, well, what I'm going to go through with you now is the actual known risk factors or the things that are much more likely to be at the root of it. And then we can kind of see if we think any of those sort of apply to you. And I literally will go through the established risk factors, right? One of them being the top one, previous trauma, right? So that is our top risk factor. So I'll say, a top risk factor is actually a previous trauma. So if you reflect on anything that happened even in your last pregnancy or the birth or the postpartum period, is there anything that lands for you there? And many, many times, Joe, it's, oh my gosh, yes, that first birth, I went in expecting this, or this happened, or maybe it's not the birth, but in the postpartum period, baby had a tongue and lip tie, and that was really, really stressful, and going to appointments and the breastfeeding is really difficult. And it starts to give us some clues in terms of, what might be happening and kind of creating a bit of a signature here in the system, right? So that's the first one is trauma. And so where that also will pick up too is maybe a mama having no issues the first time, but then between sort of that pregnancy and the next one, there's been a miscarriage in between, or things haven't gone as well. And now there's been lots of fertility treatments that have happened, right? So it's sort of understanding that risk factor. Then it's going to the next one, which is around dissatisfaction with work. This is the next established risk factor that a lot of people don't know. So, for example, I had a lot of teachers through COVID, and of course, I was doing a lot of virtual care, come have an appointment with me because of this pregnancy-related pelvic girdle pain, and kind of like your scenario, saying like I was fine this time, but this time I do. I think it's because I'm sitting more at work. I think that's kind of the problem. And me saying back to them, well, the environment and the morale around teaching right now with COVID, would you say that's the same as it was like with your job before? And always I would be met back with, no, oh my gosh, like work is a real strain. It's a real drain. And helping them to understand, well, the data would support that being much more likely to be kind of driving some of this issue actually than the postural things, right? And I go through the list. The next one is high BMI. And really the proposed mechanism there is inflammation. The next one is smoking. The proposed mechanism there is inflammation. Mm-hmm. And then the last one is lack of belief of improvement. Mm-hmm. And this kind of hits the head on that scenario you said to me before in terms of this is related to your pregnancy and you're only going to get more pregnant. I mean, you're going to have no belief that this is going to get better. In fact, you're going to believe it's going to get worse. And that is like a huge risk factor for that issue. And we can see where that ties into unhelpful notions about what this thing is all about. And that also predicts persistency, right? So this is usually how I go with my clients. I'll kind of try to get from them, well, what are they thinking first? And I'll say, okay, well, this is actually what we know. There's a lot we don't know, and every person's different, but these are the things we do know. And then it can at least be a helpful starting point for people because they can kind of match to what things might be relevant to them. And it can sort of start to get them thinking along the lines more of like the physiology that might be driving their current certain circumstances versus the mechanics.
Mm-hmm. So really you're saying beliefs should be as important or potentially more important than biomechanics. I know that can be a tricky place to have a conversation with, and sometimes our fellow practitioners, right?
Absolutely. So I've been known to actually say that exact comment, beliefs are more important than biomechanics. And I've gotten some flack and some pushback with that particular phrase. But I think it's because people are really not contextualizing what I mean. And this is what I really try. And probably sometimes I do it better than others, but I try to make sure the person in front of me gets this, that we are not saying that it's just a matter of just like thinking you're going to be fine and you're going to be fine. That's not what we're saying. It's more helping people to understand that your cognitions, your understanding of something, right? Lack of belief of improvement. But what does that actually do in your biology? What does that actually do in your physiology? And it does a lot. It does a lot of very specific things in terms of turning on your threat response, changing cortisol, driving up inflammation. I mean, there's very specific pathophysiologic things that happens from the cognitions. So I'm not suggesting that the beliefs aren't actually rooted in legitimate biology. Actually, they are. If anything, I'm trying to help people to think more about this physiologically. And then, of course, we can move into all the things that will help to kind of modulate their physiology in, a calmer, happier way so that, they're not as sensitive from a pain perspective. But absolutely, cognitions are so important. We know that for all lumbopelvic pain, and this issue is within that umbrella, that cognitions are really important. How we understand and make sense of this pain experience and how we understand our biology is really, really, really important.
Yeah. I mean, really what you're trying to break down the biopsychosocial model of pelvic girdle pain for people, which just the biopsychosocial model right there is really tough, right? For people to understand that can be tough. So obviously your biology, right? So the chemistry in your body impacts your health. Your psychology, which you said wonderfully, how you think impacts your biochemistry, right? And a lot of what we're talking about, we're kind of dancing around this. We haven't really got to yet, but I want to bring it into the conversation, is the social aspect, meaning how our culture, the people and all the things around you impact your health. And it's funny because I was walking today to get a cup of coffee this morning. I have to pass a New York City school and tons of kids and families. And I had this moment where I was like, wow, life really does revolve around kids and families in a lot of ways. Like our society is we're a family built society. How damaging is it that this belief system really cuts through healthcare, right? It cuts through families, it cuts through different generations because these beliefs are carried forward from one generation to the next, passed down from person to person. And the one thing that you're right about is beliefs may not always be more important than biomechanics, but beliefs are more important than biomechanics when it comes to the persistence of pain.
And absolutely. And I would say the data for this particular pain presentation actually would show that beliefs are probably more relevant for this one, contrary to popular belief. I like what you brought up there, though, about the social context, because that is really important. Not only do we have sort of these beliefs around what's sort of driving this particular pain experience, which because it's misguided, it actually keeps people stuck and actually sets them up for further dysfunction, right? But we have these whole sort of cultural beliefs actually around birth, which I think is a big part of the issue with this particular pain experience. Our bodies are just not up to the challenge of birthing. We need all these medicalized things for birth. Birth is going to be painful, 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 and scary, scary, scary. And we see that fear, like fear in general, not just fear of movement, but fear is really important sort of vector for this particular pain presentation. So I even think sort of culturally, the whole birth piece is part of this. And so it shows that social cultural component does really feed in, is strong, and is something that we have to think about. And I really do think a whole other side, but related issue is the whole fear around birth and over medicalization of birth, and that our bodies just aren't up to doing this unless we have a force without sight, right? It's all of that. So you're right, it is. It's essentially like biopsychosocial considerations for this.
You have a magic wand and you like to kind of wave in a couple places to change all this, where I mean, obviously people are going to listen to this podcast, they're going to share with all their friends and family to share this new belief around really pregnancy and the health that you can experience, but where would you like to see this first, or how would you like to see this potentially first change?
I guess what I would like first is for people to understand that and all people, practitioners, individuals, to understand that there is a difference between sort of a pregnancy-related ache and pain and pregnancy-related pelvic girdle pain, right? So probably most women who have been pregnant, I mean, myself included, can at least say, yeah, there was a couple days that I had a bit of pain somewhere, but I put a heat pack on it, or I did a little bit of extra yoga. I took it easy. I maybe took the next day off and I was fine, right? They were able to sort of manage it with their own toolbox and being able to kind of interpret just that their body needed a little bit more sort of relaxation potentially, right? And they could sort it out. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about with the data on this issue, where we have high comorbid fear, depression, debilitating, coming off work, like this is what we're talking about, and it's common. We have to understand that not unlike other pain experience, we've sort of stepped out of nociception and stepped over into kind of this nociplastic situation. And it isn't going to be helpful in those situations to ever just think about the mechanics. Instead, just feeling more empowered to think about what are all the different things you might be able to do to better support resilience in that system. And, clearing out previous traumas, or at least kind of acknowledging those as one of them, but just all the basic principles around developing resilience and, decreasing neuroinflammation in terms of getting adequate sort of rest and restoration and nutrition and like all of the things, right? It's so much more empowering actually for people when they understand this for what it actually is, right? So that is what I would love for people to understand. Look at the infographic and sort of understand this issue for what it actually is, and see that you can be very, very empowered to start doing things, to start supporting your system, to turn down that sensitivity knob to help the pain go away, that it actually can be completely gone before you birth that baby. It is not tracking with the pregnancy. It doesn't have anything to do with that, right?
Give us an idea of what's in the infographic. Can you read us some of the data that's there?
Yeah, so it's kind of divided into these like 3 sections: strong, stable, and self-manageable. And they might be in a slightly different order. I'm kind of doing it from memory here. And really, it's to cultivate, there's so much data, even if we just look at the literature around sacroiliac joint pain that isn't specific to pregnancy-related pelvic girdle pain, but sacroiliac joint pain, right? And there was another great paper, actually, something similar titled, Changing the Narrative of Sacroiliac Joint Pain, right? And really, the takeaway message from that review was one of the most important things is to sort of manage fears and incorrect cognitions around pain, because that seems to be very, very relevant, fear and the sacroiliac joint pain. But the next one was really helping people to understand how robust of a structure the pelvis is. Very robust, right? So this is kind of where that notion of like strong and robust came. And then we have the word stable, because many people kind of look at this as an instability issue, and it's not. And then we have the piece around self-manageable, for people to kind of know that, no, it's not to say you can just kind of do it alone, but with some guidance, and you now understand your pain experience, you understand what's happening, and you understand different tools that you can use. It isn't something that you need to be in a practitioner's office every single week, kind of having them fix you. You can understand what's happening and actually navigate your way with some tools, right? So within those, we break it down a little bit further and talk about some of the things we talked about today, like around the hormones, right? Yes, hormones are relevant, but not how we thought. How, this isn't an issue about, weak core muscles or posture, right? So we mentioned that in the infographic. We talk about lifestyle interventions and really anything that will help to create slightly better homeostasis and less sort of systemic inflammation, right? And then we have a few other topics. We make a mention around breastfeeding. There's some thoughts that in that postpartum period, if you're breastfeeding longer, that's going to maintain a hormonally altered environment for longer, and that will then correlate with higher pain. But actually, the data shows us the opposite. With breastfeeding, we have more oxytocin, which is actually anti-inflammatory. So we see that it's actually protective. So if anything, some of those studies reinforce the inflammatory theory rather than the stability theory, right? And then, one of the things we do acknowledge is, look, some what we call sort of external supports, and we lump manual therapy and external kind of garment wear or into that category to say, absolutely, those can be helpful as long as they are applied within the context of really helping to kind of empower someone, helping someone to kind of feel safe and supported, and not really giving the notion that someone's unstable or needs to be put back into place. Right? So there can be some really great value. And then, of course, we have a thing about exercise and movement. Like, it's critical we get these people feeling safe in their body and able to move well. We need mamas to be fit and healthy and well and exercising. And they cannot do that if they have this pain experience that they don't understand. And then they're kind of like really kind of going downwards, right? So they need to understand what's happening and then start to kind of get on a really good road to kind of health and function.
So we want people to know that relaxin is not the cause of your pain, and it doesn't make your ligaments loose, where your pelvis or the pelvic bones are going to move all over the place without your control. You want people to know that your pelvis is a strong and stable anatomical piece of your body, no matter who you are. And you want people to know that there are simple lifestyle tools that you can use to create resiliency in yourself as you head into or through your pregnancy for both your mind and your body. Absolutely.
Perfect summary, Joe.
Well, it's important that people hear that, because what they're hearing, as you've articulated for the last half hour, is they're hearing you've now given us a list of, God, at least 20 or 30 things that they hear, right? So we're competing with decades of, false news. Right? Fake news. Fake news about pelvic girdle pain, basically.
Yep, absolutely.
And it's important because this happens day in and day out of many women's health services, not just PT clinics, but, OBGYN, et cetera, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess the other thing I would say too, which is a little bit of a plug for virtual care. It's been so interesting with COVID. I guess one of the silver linings for that has sort of been, practitioners like you and I and others really adopting to these virtual care modes. But that's also made people like us kind of more accessible to people all around the world. Yeah. And I have to say, it's been really interesting for me to even see myself how this plays out in virtual care, because I'm seeing people from all around the world who have been to many, many people who are saying the same narrative about, it's things out of place and it's this, that, and they're still struggling. And, I'm able to kind of do a consult with them in virtual care, really applying principles of psychologically informed care and behavior change and sort of some of those tenets of, pain neuroscience like reframing, but also some of the mindfulness and acceptance approaches that we can kind of do nicely virtually. And just not even being tempted to do some of the things I might be tempted to do if I was with someone in person, and just seeing firsthand how effective it is. It really does reinforce, wow, this really does have, more to do with these other things. And if people can really understand it and you can help guide them with the tools, they really can create health in themselves really, really, really well. Yeah. Right?
You've mentioned trauma and resilience a bunch of times. And the one population of veterans, there's now starting to be programs that people who go into the defense system, they actually take there's some testing. There's some programs they take now before they go into like a place of war, where they're provided with tools to help build their resiliency. Because the higher your resiliency is, it decreases the potential or the risk factors related to trauma. Should we look at pregnancy as a traumatic experience, or at least start to prepare people with some of the same tools and have programs and services built around that?
I think there's a good argument for that, Joe. I mean, we know predictably that there's a high number. I want to say the percentage is something like 30% after your first birth, where you're actually diagnosed with PTSD from what just happened. And then if we kind of put aside even those people who kind of go through that process and it's normalized for them, so they're not even really aware that they were kind of traumatized by that. And then if we kind of look at the people where they're very aware that a physical trauma has happened, a 3rd-degree tear, a 4th-degree tear, and forceps use. I mean, some of these things are very, very predictable. And you're quite right that we have like good data around even different aspects of mindfulness interventions. Myself and Tracy Donegan, she's a midwife and she's the founder of a whole kind of program called Gentle Birth, but it's built into an app. And so we actually have a paper submitted, but really what we found was individuals who were doing essentially what we referred to it as brain training, a combination of kind of hypnobirthing, kind of mindfulness training, but seeing that that had such a positive impact, not only on their satisfaction with birth, but actually in terms of way less interventions and like the whole list that goes down. So I agree with you. I think we have to change some of the narrative and thinking and just culture around birth, coming back to that component. But, you know, having some kind of program set up, similar to like what you mentioned about the veterans, to build up that resilience, I think could probably go a long way. And, you know, hopefully kind of more research continues from this initial work that Tracy and I have done.
Sinead, it's been great speaking with you today about how we can reframe pregnancy-related pelvic girdle pain and the importance of this topic for both practitioners as well as people who are in the middle of their pregnancy or potentially even planning a pregnancy. If people would like to learn more about you and follow your work, how can they do that?
So you can follow me at The Womb, www.thewomb.ca. That's kind of my second home, I guess. That's my clinical practice. And so you can find me there, but you can also find me on Instagram. My handle is dr.sinead. And, you know, through my Instagram, you can link onto my bio and it takes you to my McMaster page and all my publications and some of the other different teaching companies I work for. So those are probably the two best spots, the womb and then my Instagram page.
Great. So of course, all those links will be in the show notes at the Integrative Pain Science Institute, or you can just hit record on your phone right now and play those back and just take a note. But reach out to Sinead and let her know how much you've enjoyed this episode and the importance of this topic for women and health professionals understanding how to treat and manage pelvic girdle pain. I'm Dr. Joe Tatta, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Healing Pain Podcast with Dr. Joe Tatta. To subscribe to the podcast and learn more, visit integrativepainscienceinstitute.com. That's Integrative Pain Science Institute.com. Sign up to receive weekly updates, leave a review on iTunes, and share this episode with your friends.